Hey guys, so I wanted to do a video on the topic of high magic. It's a topic that's interested me for a little while now, and there's a particular book on it by Frater U.D, not his real name, it's his magical alias. I've actually read this a few times through now, and I'd been meaning to do a video on it because I did the videos on spirituality and sort of connected it to Christian theology as well. And this is yet another kind of school of thought. And I was wondering where to start with this, because a lot of people will wonder what on earth high magic is. So I thought I'd start with a couple of definitions from the book. Magicians are all individualists who prefer not to be categorized or labelled in simple terms that do nothing to promote understanding, but who actually distort the picture instead. Now that doesn't give you too much of a clue, but it starts to give you a little bit of an idea as to what's going on. With magic, one desires to influence every aspect of one's fate that seems beyond control by using just ordinary means, and the magician can succeed. Modern magic is primarily a path to self-discovery or spiritual wholeness. So it does incorporate all sorts of ideas, including spirituality, Eastern spirituality, even some ideas from Christianity as well. There's a particular line in here, I think I've highlighted the page, because I didn't really know where to start originally, and I thought, well, actually let's start with some sort of cast iron definitions. So let's have a look here. Where to start with here? The heritage of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment didn't make a real impact on magic until late in our modern times, but that impact is that the individual is ruthlessly placed in the centre of one's own universe, so that one finally learns to assume responsibility for his or her own life, an image of reality, instead of hanging on the skirts of some father or mother god, divine in brackets commandments, imposed morals and ethics, church or community, only striving to become a perfectly functioning agent or slave to someone else's will, in the hopes of getting a nice spot in the sun in the afterlife, of being forgiven of all sins, of positive karma, or of social recognition that have been luring humanity for thousands of years. Instead, modern magic wants everyone to have self-determination and be able to act on one's inner experience and wisdom. So yeah, it's where this is coming from. Now reading that sounds quite atheistic, and to be honest, in some respects this is to a degree, but it doesn't have to be, I think. I think because once you read through some of this stuff, there are elements of like Buddhism in it, and it references Aleister Crowley and his magic book a lot in this, and he even saw himself as kind of connected with Buddhism in some ways. I mean, this particular tome is a big book. It's like 400 odd pages, and they're like big pages as well. A lot of writing, a lot of stuff in here. And yeah, it was difficult to know where to begin, but it was a topic I at least wanted to cover in one of these videos. Here we go. This is a good place to start, although we've started now. But magic is the science and art of causing changes to occur in conformity with will. Magic is the science. And an update. That's the kind of definition that Aleister Crowley first had. But there's a new sort of updated definition. Magic is the science and art of using states of altered consciousness for causing changes to occur in conformity with will. And so, in answer to the question, what is high magic? A lot of it is using, there is actually a formula in here, using the magical imagination in accordance with your own will in a state of gnosis to bring about a magical or a real life cast iron solid result. So it's performing, so actually I just had it there, will plus, so then an early formulation is will plus imagination equals magic, which is the more simplistic way of looking at it, but it's basically, here we go, magic makes use of both the so-called rational and irrational components of the human personality. Magic actually aims at achieving the spiritual totality and unity of a person. There is spiritual goals in mind in this book as well. and a lot of it comes back to talking about the will, and it gives a little concept in here: to know, to will, to dare, and to be silent. So to know, I won't read all of it, because one thing I don't want to do is give away everything in this book, because I don't want to be unfair to the author, but at the same time I did want to cover the subject, so I at least want to talk about some of the ideas in this book. And obviously there are a lot of tomes on higher magical concepts, but this one by Frater U.D, I've read cover to cover probably about 3 or 4 times now, and it is one that I come back to. I've got the second one as well, but this one's got all of the sort of core concepts in to start with, and then the second one branches out into kind of different areas. But so going back to that concept, to know, mainly it means intuition, or that gut feeling from deep down inside that only can be achieved through personal experience. So that's like knowing, but it basically means knowing on an experiential level, like when you actually try some of these magical practices and things and you learn for experience. To will, many modern day magicians regard the ultimate goal of higher magic to be the recognition of one's own true will, or thelema, as it has been referred to by Aleister Crowley. To dare, the fear of magic itself is one of the greatest dangers a person will encounter on his or her magical path. So to dare is to leap, as it were, to overcome. One of the things it says at the end of this is look and leap. So it's like to dare to take the leap, to try some of these magical practices and see what comes of it through your own experience. And it is a path. It sets this out in here as like it's a path that you can potentially always be on once you start it. And it's probably why I've ended up coming back to it, because I've gone different ways in the past where I've, sort of gone into Eastern spirituality quite a lot and gone through sort of like almost like a phase of that, although I took it very seriously. I still see things as like phases, because I'm not always into a particular thing, though the concepts of it may be in the back of my mind, but I sort of take from a bit of this and a bit of that. I've not really ever nailed myself down to one particular thing, although probably Eastern philosophy and spirituality has lasted the longest. But again, some of this magic stuff is stuff that I do come back to on and off, and it's why I was interested in wanting to cover it in a video. So to dare, we've covered to be silent. In reality, the mysteries surrounding magic protect themselves exceptionally well, and it's impossible to unveil them, because their actual secret is contained in the experience that the initiate makes with them. These realms of experience can never be taken away from the magician, and can never be tarnished by an outsider or ignorant person. And then it says, so part of to be silent is, nevertheless, it's advisable to not be all too open about your own occult interests, as the prejudices that a magician encounters, even in these modern times of enlightenment and tolerance, are still great, as is the energy wasted on defending oneself against such opposition. So, for example, doing a video like this is probably not advised, but I take an interest in the subject. I'm not saying I believe in absolutely everything in this book, but I'm definitely intrigued by it, and it's definitely got some really interesting ideas for anyone who is interested in this kind of thing. What else have I got? Oh, being silent also means the idea of putting a lid on the pot, meaning that by stopping a bubbling cauldron, as it were, one creates the necessary amount of pressure to cook. This pressure is the magical power that we call magius. So there's 2 different ways of looking at that. So that's covered that slogan. I'm not going to cover everything in here because it's a big book, but I at least wanted to go through some of the core concepts. So it brings you quite early on to the first ritual to try, which is the lesser banishing ritual of the Pentagram, which is meant to ground the magician or the initiate and sort of give him confidence in his magical ability. And it talks about how to do that. You open with something called the Kabbalistic Cross, which I've kind of read in here and learned how to do. Invocation of archangels, again a link to sort of spiritual concepts. The archangels come up a lot in this, so that is that. Magic is also art. On the one hand, the art of creating a certain balance, on the other the art of removing it and replacing it with a new one. And that's a lot of what comes up in this book. It's creating your own reality, seeing what is, deciding on a change to what is, and then through magical means trying to make that change occur, or something very similar to it. What else have we got? Skip some of this. Yeah, I don't want to go too deep into some of the real nitty-gritty of it, but I at least wanted to cover some of the core ideas. So I'm going to skip over some of this. Yeah, then it introduces you to sigil magic, which is another interesting practice. Magical power lies in the subconscious mind. If we can succeed in smuggling commands or statements of intent past the conscious mind to the subconscious mind, and there's a thing in the beginning about how it passes through a sensor, and you almost have to switch off the sensor through gnosis or a hypnotic trance or magical trance to get the idea that you want into the subconscious so that it then makes it happen. So yeah, if we can succeed in smuggling commands or statements of intent past the conscious mind to the subconscious, our experience has shown that this enables the desired result to manifest within the scope of one's powers. And then it goes on a little more. So yeah, we disguise our desires and statements of intent, enabling them to march right by the palace guards, namely our censor, unhindered straight to the armory of our inner soul. And this idea has actually been, I don't know if he was the man who came up with the idea or if he just developed it, but I think he may be the one who came up. There was a man called Austin Osman Spare, who's referred to, again, not quite as much as Crowley in this book, but is referred to a lot. And there's a whole chapter on him as well. His comment was, in brackets, sigils will flesh, which means that they become an integral part of the human organism, which in turn applies all of the strength and power available in every one of its cells to convert them into action. In magic, the function of the conscious mind is to define the predetermined goal, acting as a sort of pilot. The subconscious mind, on the other hand, has the responsibility of converting the commands and goals as promisingly as possible, acting as the engineer. The censor is assigned the function of protecting the entire process, keeping everything running and eradicating any undesired internal or external factors. Its duty officer, as it were. It will be evaded and re-educated, as it were, by working with the Gnostic or magical trance. Once the magician is able to merge it with his or her true will or philema, through constant practice, it will become its embodiment. I mean, that's quite a deep way of looking at it, but basically, you train the conscious mind to be able to put something past the censor, so that the subconscious receives it and it becomes real. And this is similar to, it's really similar to the idea of like hypnotherapy and hypnosis, where you put an idea, you go past the sense to the subconscious mind to instill new ideas and things that you want, like new attitudes and things like that. So it's quite similar to that in its intent. And the idea for it is, and I won't go too much into it, I'm not going to say how to make a sigil and things like that, so again, I don't want to give away everything in this book, but I at least want to cover some of it. First formulate your statement of intent, then convert it into a sigil by means of the ways that you create sigils, which are discussed in the book, and then you charge it, also discussed in the book, implanting it into your subconscious mind through Gnostic trance. And there are various different methods of doing that. It talks about the word method, and later on it talks about the picture method, and there are other methods as well, but I'm gonna skip some of that because again it's not fair on the author if I give everything away. Another thing about magicians, a magician is a master of illusion. He or she sees through things, learns the laws of nature, uses them to one's advantage, and forces reality to comply with them, or at least that's the idea. One of the goals of magical education should therefore be the training of one's magical perception. And it says about the idea of pretending is practiced frequently enough, it will cause a desired real effect on a material or conscious level. Anything that you cannot actually perceive during a visualization must either be imagined or accepted as reality until you're able to do so. And a lot of it is training your conscious mind to visualize in a certain way, so that the goal of what you want does actually come about. The art of magical illusion is achieved by forcefully and repeatedly declaring illusions to be reality until they have actually become reality, which is quite a cool concept. And it talks a little bit about visualization. There's practical exercises all the way through this book as well. At the end of the chapters there's practical exercises, and some of them are really quite deep as well. There's stuff in here about dream work and a magical gaze, the way that you sort of perceive, like with your magical gaze as it were, and that has various different reasons for doing that as well. So then we talk about, and again, saying about how this connects to spirituality. There's a chapter called Psychology or Spiritualism. The principle that supports a more psychological explanation and believes that everything magical arises from deep inside the magician's soul itself is called animism, from the Latin word anima, or soul. The other principle that's based on the existence of real non-human living beings and those made up of subtle energies is called spiritualism, from the Latin word spiritus, spirit. And obviously, what else have we got? The concept that our reality is always the reality of the description should be confronted at an early stage. Our reality merely reflects that which we are able to express and perceive in one way or another. And there is a lot in here about paradigm shifting. And in fact, here we are, it's right on the next page. This is really interesting. And again, I don't want to give away everything in the book, but I at least want to cover some core concepts, because there's a lot of practice and things, and it goes deeper into actual methods and things, which I'm not going to cover, so that people have a reason to buy this. I mean, I've not barely touched the surface of what's in here, but a paradigm is a set of basic ideological or technological assumptions or beliefs, and therefore a model of explanation. Since magic is always a reality dance, it would be logical to experiment with various paradigms. The magician should become familiar with various philosophies of life, not only in theory, but more importantly in practice as well. Only then can one control every aspect of his or her own reality production, and magic is nothing more than that, to fit one's individual needs, regardless of whether these concern everyday practical magic or of a more mystical nature. So yeah. What else have we got here? Born out of the attempt to recognise at least a minimum amount of inner unity in all religious, mystical and magical systems, that occultism is now widely tolerated due to its respect of all other paradigms. Skipping a little bit here. Yeah, so again, this is where it gets interesting. The magician chooses one belief, like the surgeon chooses his or her instruments. Belief, the idea that belief is just a technique. I might read this a little bit. Actually, hang on. I just don't want to give too much away, because I don't want the author to be pissed off at me. A person who doesn't strive for the absolute in the external world will never again be subject to the illusions that the external world may present as absolute reality. The idea that nothing is true, everything is permitted. On the other hand, rigid systems are always subject to limitation. Through frequent conscious system shifting, the magician creates a much larger area for manoeuvring. He or she not only becomes more versatile, but even has more potential, because he or she has become aware of the illusionary character of limits, and no longer needs to accept them helplessly as before. Magic has always been similar to walking on a tightrope without a net, and it's surely not wrong to say that a magician usually has one foot in the grave and the other in the nut house. The trick is keeping your balance without landing in one or the other, thereby enjoying the complete freedom of someone who walks the line, but in order to do so, thorough grounding is an absolute must. And it talks about methods of grounding. It says one of them is the best method of grounding is to have a normal everyday job. Yeah, so again, this book does warn about the possibility of megalomania and like actually seeing yourself as a god once you start doing some of the things in it. And it does warn, not to keep a check on yourself and not to go completely nuts, because it has happened to people that have followed this path. Hang on a minute. If you think about the above statements a bit more, we'll discover that magicians often have to function in quite extreme states of consciousness that differ considerably from everyday reality, although they'll be integrating their magic into their everyday life more and more with practice. This doesn't mean that the borderlines between the two become blurred, they merely become more permeable. These are two entirely different things, and shamanistic cultures in particular show us again and again how serious the problem of spiritual stability is dealt with by these magical experts. For example, every member of such a tribe accepts the fact that there are spirits and that one can perceive them and communicate with them. This is definitely not true in our rationalistic civilization. Such a person who sees spirits and talks with them regularly will probably end up in a padded cell, which is how our culture deals with such deviations from the norm. But if a member of a native tribe constantly sees spirits that haunt one wildly, and if one even neglects his or her everyday obligations to the community for this reason, this person would certainly be declared insane and he or she be expelled from society. So yeah, it does talk about keeping yourself grounded, and though you might experiment, and this book is all about experimentation with magical ritual and the very paradigms of how we see life. I mean, it even talks, one of the practices in here is about just for like a week or whatever, deciding that something you really held fast and believed isn't true, and seeing how you manage believing something else. Like, you know, I mean, an easy example would be like, say, like a music you really hate, actually you decide you really love that for a week, and seeing how that goes. But I mean, it goes way deeper than that. But it's like, yeah, it is experimenting with the idea of your own paradigms, your own how you see the world, and it can get pretty out there. But this is a point here. Extreme magical experiences can sometimes unconsciously trigger psychological disturbances, but it's important to remember that it's not the magic that can drive a person insane. On the contrary, it does nothing more than tear open the veil, covering our psychological sham existence, in which an occasional swamp blossom can thrive among the shadows that silently poison the organism as a whole. Confronting one's own fears, which every good magician does thoroughly, is a good example of this process. And it talks about sort of the limits of our own mind, and only a person who knows and realises one's limits is able to overcome them. Then there's another ritual, which is the greater ritual of the Pentagram, which is kind of complex, and I'm not going to go into. Talks about elemental symbols, the symbological fuzzy relation, which the only thing I'll say about it is the two things that are written at the bottom, which are: the less precise the message of an oracle is, the more likely it is to be accurate. The more precise the message, the less likely it is to be accurate. I'm not going to go too much into that because that gets a bit complicated. The secret of a successful master magician is the ability to define the goal as precisely as possible while leaving the path to its realisation wide open, and only specifying the minimum in detail required to prevent unwanted results. That's about as far as I'll go into that. Yeah, and it talks about applied paradigm shifting, planetary magic, talking about planetary symbols and elements. That gets a bit, yeah, it has actual diagrams of the planets, their symbols, their number, their ritual formula and things like that. Yeah, all this about planetary principles. And then it talks about the magician's tools, which are the actual tools of like a magician's trade, as it were. And it describes, I don't know if to go into all of them. I don't want to give too much away because I don't want to be unfair to the author. But for instance, it talks about your magic temple, the magic dagger, cup, wand, sword, things like that. Yeah, basically it says the magical tools are merely symbolic aids that are meant to bring the magician's spirit into a certain gnosis. By structuring one's universe externally as well as internally with symbols, one's creating anchors for various states of consciousness. The externalization projection must be absolute in order for it. Yeah, no, again, I'm not going to cover that bit. Basically, the idea is that you start off using magical tools in your ritual. Like you may use a wand to draw a pentagram or a symbol or something that you need to do in a ritual. And the idea is that you're using that tool as like a training wheels, because eventually the idea is that you use what it refers to in here as the empty hand. So you've astrally projected in your mind that tool through use of it, so that you don't eventually need to use it, so that you can imagine, I don't know, like light shooting out of your hand and things like that, which on a sort of magical gnosis level is real, so that the ritual works. But I won't go too far into it. Ritual offers us the opportunity to perceive the choreography of magical energies in a controlled situation, as well as to capture these and use them for our work. People are always busy performing symbolic acts with the intention of structuring their cosmos and making it comprehensible by creating points of reference and orientation, which in turn create opportunities for acting and manoeuvring. In this sense, magical rituals are the logical and consequential continuation of a proven living technique that already governs our entire existence anyway. The difference being, magicians design our rituals ourselves for the most part, making them ideally more accurate, without letting them become reduced to nothing but hollow, meaningless shells. It talks about the magical temple, where the magic is practiced in your rituals, how to do that. But it's an interesting topic. I didn't just want to sit and read the book to you guys, but because I covered spirituality and Christian theology, I at least wanted to give this side of things, because this is something else again, you know. And it talks about how how some people refer to some of the ideas in here as like black magic and things like that, or the dark arts. But there's a lot more to it in terms of thought processes and things than just that. And there's a lot of different schools of thought incorporated into this system. I'm just trying to see if there's anything else that I want to talk about for the time being. Yeah, it talks about Austin Osman Spare. The idea, roughly summarised, Freud's thesis. So it talks about Sigmund Freud and his role in the idea of psychological repression. Roughly summarised, Freud's thesis claims that the psyche represses certain trauma, impulses, fears, and other parts of the conscious mind into the unconscious or subconscious for various reasons. This can lead to pathological behaviour such as compulsiveness, neurosis, or psychosis. In other words, through repression, these components of the soul remain active only in the subconscious, but in no way do they lose their effectiveness, and on the contrary, they can even force the conscious mind to behave in a seemingly rational manner that is in reality controlled by the subconscious. Spare's idea didn't view this psychological mechanism as disturbing or undesired, seeking its elimination, but rather recognised it as in an entirely pragmatic sense as being predefined and therefore quite practical for magical use. So he basically is taking what Freud saw as as almost like a problem with the mind, psychological repression, and actually uses it to someone's advantage by purposefully repressing things so that they come up in life. And that is what the sigil magic is about. A magical desire cannot become truly effective until it has become an organic part of the subconscious mind. Each and every desire is repressed immediately through the method and not allowed to stay in the conscious mind for any period of time. Once embedded in the subconscious, this desire acts like a complex, functioning independently while striving towards fulfillment. The magician who works according to Spare's method uses the repression mechanism of the psyche to one's advantage. By purposely repressing the desired goal, one takes advantage of the psychological fulfillment automatism and forces the subconscious to bring about desired effects. But yeah, basically what I just said, but in other words. Seeing if there's anything else related to that I need to say. Yeah, that's about on that one. So the thing that you're actually doing the sigil magic for, the purpose, is to make something come true, like a wish or desire. And it says the wish or desire must first be suffocated, then separated from the self and fed with energy so that it's able to carry out its job. One can often observe, even among non-practitioners of magic, that desires most likely to come true are those that often surface in the conscious mind for just a fraction of a subjective second, only to immediately disappear again and be covered up by other material. That's something I've seen in my own life just through accident, because I've read about the idea of manifestation in books before, like The Secret and things like that, but that was a long time ago. But I've noticed that the things that pop into your head for the least length of time, just as an idle thought, maybe as you're watching something or walking around, and just go about your day, and then it just goes as quickly as it came, within 24 hours or around about that time, you'll see a reference to that again, and you'll think, oh, I just thought of that yesterday. And that's manifestation, but the thing that makes it manifest more quickly is how quickly you forget it, or how even you don't even focus on it that long. Maybe you focused on it for a minute because you thought about it and that was all the focus it needed, and then it went back down into the subconscious or whatever, and you thought about something else, or something else happened that grabbed your attention. But that thing then goes into the subconscious and re-manifests itself, because the subconscious is kind of a manifestation machine. So this is using that process for actual achievable ends. Yeah, let's get that. It talks about how you charge the sigil, which I'm not going to go into because that's quite a core bit of one of the practices in the book, and I don't want to give it away. Talks about the magical robe and what it's for. Other garments that you would wear for your magical practices. More practical ideas. Yeah, I'm going to skip some of this. So I've covered quite a fair bit there. Also, there's sections on mantra meditation, which again, Eastern philosophy does come back into it. You know, even though I read one of those first paragraphs I read was about, you know, the idea of, you know, you're not doing this to cater to a god or whatever. You're doing it to cater to your own will. It still does incorporate things like Eastern spirituality and some Christian theology, like talking about the archangels and things like that. You may not view them in exactly the same way, but it still connects. Mantric sigils and certain formulas. I've highlighted this page. Why did I highlight this page? Oh, that was the first thing I read, actually. That was one. More about planetary magic. Yeah, more about symbols, and then actually things that correspond to the symbols, what they call correspondences, which can be colours and smells and things that you would use in a ritual, certain scents and certain colours, certain metals. Talks about another type of ritual. Actual lays out the structure of a ritual. So there's a lot of practical in this book, as well as all of the theoretical ideas. I mean, I'm more interested in the theoretical ideas, although I have sort of dabbled in some of the practice, though not to any major degree. I haven't gone as far as getting all the items you would use for a ritual and having a proper ritual space. Mantras and meditation. Talks about a magician's vulnerability, the idea of fear, and how it can actually be used. I'll just read a couple of bits from that. So fear will constantly attack what it feeds on, attracting the dreaded and begging for deliverance through stupefaction, through salvation, or through the desperation of wanting to finally put an end to it all. And yet fear is essential, and may even be the most important part of a man's primeval instincts. Fear keeps the human organism out of danger, helps it avoid situations where it might fail and be injured, thereby ensuring the continuance of its species. Consequently, it's in no way desirable to eliminate fear entirely, at least not until this instinct has learned to optimally perform its vital functions on another fear-free level, without subjecting the organism as a whole to such tormenting fear to make it get out of the way of danger or render it harmless. To become a fear-free person who no longer needs this alarm mechanism is hard work that could take decades or even a lifetime to achieve. So the magician takes a pragmatic approach and utilises fear where one can, in order to gain control of it little by little, so that one's finally able to decide freely which fears one wants to keep for whatever reason, and which ones to eliminate or convert into valuable energy. Therefore, we should learn to respect fear without letting it control every aspect of our being. The serious magician will encounter more than enough opportunities to turn the lead of fear into the gold of bravery and courage, of independence and fearlessness, and of security and composure that spring from the true love of oneself, the recognition of one's true will, and the acceptance of one's own power and might. Literally speaking, magic really has to do with growing up, and the final exam is fear itself and the way one chooses to deal with it, which I think is a really good concept. And it's nice that things like that come into this as well. It's, you know, when they say about, you know, people are a bit fearful of mysticism and things like that, but actually there's some really positive goals in this book as well. Yeah. Just thinking of any other bits in here. Because where are we now? Because we're about halfway through the book here. I don't want to do the whole thing, but I just wanted to at least cover some of the main ideas. Magic principally means establishing a certain intentional reality and asserting it despite any possible resistance from the outside world. Magic is actually the production of reality. It includes everything that serves the purpose of creating reality, and the idea of magic is always the perception of magic. Reality to a magician is not a rigid, inflexible constant, but more of a greatness that's constantly flowing and can never be clearly defined. Again, the idea of like experimenting with paradigms, I think, is part of that as well. Talks more about magical rituals. Yeah. This is something else as well. There's talking about mysticism. There's a bit called Mysticism or Magic. Let me just have a quick. Prayer and magical ritual. Mysticism and magic, the basic difference between them is that prayer demands a lot of faith and devotion from the person praying, yet very little skill and talent. Magical ritual demands only little faith, but all the more skill. Devotion to a deity is substituted by perseverance and persistence. The abandonment of dogma and the emphasis on magical dexterity. Again, these are the kind of things that separate it from religion or spiritual beliefs to a degree. Well, probably quite largely. As we'll see again and again in conjunction with our practice of invocational magic, the temporary submission of a magician to some higher principle is often one of the basic requirements for magical success. So there still is an element of that, of submitting to something higher than oneself. So it does link in that respect. Spirituality, mystical models. Yeah, so mystical models have always predominated, and the magical path has always been understood as the way to godhood, regardless of how this is defined. This is where it differs from Christian theology and things like that. Apart from a few early exceptions, it wasn't until the development of pragmatic magic and chaos magic that a departure from magical theism took place on a large scale, giving it mere philosophical value instead. This is all the more amazing when we remember the significant role that early Buddhism played in Eastern philosophy since the end of the classicism and romanticism periods. Philosophers such as Schopenhauer and Nietzsche cannot possibly be understood without this influence, just like Kierkegaard and the much later field of existential philosophy. The occult was influenced strongly by Buddhism as well, and even Crowley himself referred to himself as a Buddhist for quite some time, writing essays such as Science and Buddhism and radically rejecting any kind of theism, while representing a rather sceptical yet rational outlook on things before he finally became a phalemic mystic by accepting the Book of Law as a revelation that can be applied to the entire world. In any case, Western esotericism almost always worked with some kind of theism, which even included monotheism. In this, we recognise the strong and seemingly invincible influence that Judaism and Christianity have on our culture. This is inseparable from the opinion that there are higher and lower and good or bad spheres, and that religion is superior to magic in the end, since it's supposedly more true. There's no point in arguing about whether religion is the mother or daughter of magic, since there are good viewpoints on each side. And the author says he tends to support the opinion that religion probably originated from magic, although the two certainly overlapped right from the start. In the end, it's all a matter of temperament. Some people are more religious than others, probably the majority in fact, and those who prefer the magical path generally won't submit to any kind of god other than themselves for a longer period of time. Which may explain my own in and out dabbling with spirituality, Christian theism, and this kind of stuff. The fact that I've never stuck with one. I've always had a bit, followed this for a bit, then this, or a mixture of them. But mysticism and religion are surely not the same. In fact, just the opposite is true. Although the mystic considers him or herself to be a representative of true religion, in the sense of religio, as it says, or reconnecting with the origin of things, this outlook usually strongly contradicts religious orthodoxy. So, yeah. In this sense, the mystic is considered a threat to religion's carefully protected hierarchy because he or she is not dependent on it to establish communication with divine principles. Usually, mystics are more or less ignored by Christian churches, or at best just briefly mentioned without ever truly discussing their principles. Often the reason for all the scepticism surrounding mysticism is said to be the spiritual and mental health of the average person, who supposedly wouldn't be able to deal with such concepts. Mysticism has sometimes even been condemned as being seriously dangerous, which is not surprising considering the fact that many mystics have entirely done away with any church dogmas, causing them to slip into the category of self-idolization due to its mystical union with the divine. And he says this still seems to be an after effect of the notion shock caused by early Christianity. Nonetheless, mysticism and religion agree that there's some sort of divinity that humanity is subordinate to. For both, the goal of life is to make some kind of long-term arrangement with this divinity in order to realise what he calls religio, which I think is sort of like the divine state. Magic, on the other hand, is principally an ideological, neutral technique for influencing one's fate. Through its socio-cultural and, of course, religious environment, it comes into contact with other systems and merges with them. This can be clearly seen in the development of Western magic, which was influenced at a very early stage almost exclusively by Jewish Christian practices, with the exception of a few ancient pagan elements during the Middle Ages. In search of a model to explain how magic works, the predominant religion of the times was a natural reference, since it claimed to be able to explain everything anyway, and this harmonised well with its job of salvation. This is certainly not a phenomenon specific to the West, since the same procedure can also be observed, for example, in the Islam and Hindu cultural regions, so the book says. On the other hand, due to its active role in dealing with fate, magic paradoxically seems to be much closer to mysticism, which is generally described as being passive, than to religion, which merely tolerates and follows predetermined revelations and holy laws, it puts in brackets. And both rebel against external control by human authority figures. So I've written so much of this, but this is like right to the point of kind of why I was doing the video, just the way it connects with religion and spirituality and the ways that it doesn't. The mystic doesn't let him or herself be prevented from accessing the origin of all things by clinging to some artificial system created by humans. And that's an opinion, by the way, of the book, I'm just saying. And the magician isn't content with simply being a pawn in a game and a victim of fate, and therefore strives to master the powers that one sees controlling him or herself and others, which can be seen, I think, as a positive goal, to control your own reality. In this sense, it's of considerable importance in a structural sense that most mystics receive their visions and information passively and rarely strive for them, making their rebellion more of an unconscious act instead of an intentional one. So I'd like to end this video with a definition of the difference between lower and higher magic. Lower magic is considered to be everything that has to do with matter, including all types of practical magic, for example, for money, love, health, and even the expression of one's own will in general. While matter is generally considered inferior, being able to influence it is naturally a preliminary step that needs to be mastered and then eventually left behind. High magic, which is the purpose of this whole book, is more difficult to describe. Today we have two definitions. A, the conventional description in which the magician eventually succeeds in establishing contact with transcendence, again the link to spirituality there, allowing oneself from then on to be guided by it. Consequently, it says constantly becoming a saint in a way. I don't know if I would 100% agree with that, but the more modern version, although recognised in shamanism for thousands of years, that strives for independence from external means. For example, empty hands techniques are the mark of an adept, as Peter Carroll once wrote. His book Psychonaut is well worth a read as well. Liber Null and Psychonaut. That's a really interesting book on chaos magic that I'd recommend picking up. That strives for independence from external means, or a direct form of magic for directly influencing fate without needing elaborate symbolic equipment and external exercises, and not having to rely on external factors. In the first definition, the magician is a theurgic mystic, while in the second, he or she is a virtuoso technician who no longer needs any tools. And I think that is ultimately the goal of this, is to teach you how to use magic and magic ritual, and to point you in the right direction as well of other books to read and places to go, to the point where eventually you're able to make magic work for you without the tools. I mean, to be honest, I've never actually practiced any of the rituals with tools. I've always gone from the get-go for the empty hand path, but I wouldn't say I'm an adept in any sense, but I've definitely toyed with some of the ideas. Last but not least, magic is directly related to knowledge and realization, as well as to personal development and truth. The magician is understood, once again, as a searcher of the truth, in contrast to a person who merely strives for personal freedom and independence. And at the end of the day, I think that is where this connects mostly with spirituality, the idea of looking for the truth, of trying to find something to connect with that brings meaning to it all, and also trying to to create a life of one's own choosing as well, to exist in this realm in a way that makes sense to you. And I'll at least explore any path that leads to that, and that's why I think I've looked so deeply into Eastern philosophy, and kind of in more recent years dabbled, or at least researched, Christian theology and the ideas behind it, and also how I've dipped in and out of the idea of magic, high magic, not magic in like a stage magician kind of way doing tricks, but in a creating one's own reality kind of way. But yeah, I hope this has been interesting anyway, and if you do want to learn more about magic, I highly recommend this book and its sequel, High Magic 2. Also, I haven't actually read it, but Magic by Aleister Crowley, there's a lot of references to it in here, and I think that he knew his stuff, so Also, the book I mentioned, Peter Carroll, Liebernaut and Psychonaut, are well worth a look. In fact, I think they are on YouTube somewhere, actually. Someone's read them out. So that's worth a look. But and Austin Osman Spare and his Sigil Magic. Sigil Magic is worth a look anyway, for anyone who would like to try and control one's reality a little bit better. But yeah, that's about all I have to say on it today. It's a very interesting topic and an interesting book, to me anyway. And I hope you guys have got something from this. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers.